Alright, Shabbos, good morning. Let's begin. A lot to do today. Beautiful daf. We are picking up today's daf is Kuf Aleph 101, and we are picking up on the bottom of Kuf Amud Beis 100b, right by the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Hamocher Mokum Lechaver Lasos Kever. Shabbos, what we're dealing with over here is a person, right? I sell Ruvain land for the purpose that Ruvain wants to go ahead and make a kever. Now he wants to dig a grave. Now, says we're going to see that a kever does not mean a kever like we think about in our context, in terms of just a singular grave. Rather, again, what they are focusing on over here is what we call it. It's much more like a burial complex, as you're going to see in just a little bit. So I'll say, so just by way of introduction, what they used to do is the following. Essentially, they would build underground burial chambers. So the idea over here is that if I know that Reuven is essentially buying a piece of land for a family plot, so the Mishnah is going to teach me, and again, we don't articulate the dimensions of the land being purchased. The fact that he's purchasing it for a burial plot automatically dictates the size of the lot. So it says the Mishnah, Mocher mokom lechaver lasos kever. Or so I sell Reuven land for the purposes of making a burial, we'll call it a burial complex. Or we'll say, for that matter, I happen to be, I'm a burial complex contractor. It's my niche market. So what happens? So I go ahead and I get hired to go ahead and to create this space. So both say, remember, the Mishnah is dealing in a case where ultimately we just haven't specified how big the area is, how many graves are being dug. So essentially what the Mishnah is saying is, what's the standard? What's the default standard? So what's the halacha? Ose tocha shel ma'ara dalit amos al sheish. So Rabbi says, we're going to see essentially a burial complex was made up of three areas. There was a chutzner. So the chutzner essentially is the above ground, even it's above and below ground, that's the middle area. You would then enter in from a chutzner into what we call a ma'ara. So the ma'ara itself is the burial cave, and then ultimately again, off the burial cave you would have what's called these kubin. These kubin were like slots. I mean, slots is the wrong word, but they were these long and narrow tube-like things, which essentially look like vertical graves that were dug into the side of wherever they're digging, underground as well. So the Mishnah says the following. He says, Ose tocha shamara dalit amos al sheish. And you're going to see actually Rashi has pictures on Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph. So ultimately, again, you go ahead and you make the opening of the Ma'ara, right? The opening of the burial chamber itself, 4 amos by 6 amos. Uposeach lesocha shmona kuchin. And I both say you open up what we call 8 grave slots in from that ma'ara. So what happens? Uposeach lesocha shmona kuchin, shalosh mikan v'shalosh mikan u'shnayim michenegdan. 3 on one side, 3 on the other side, and 3 opposite the opening of the ma'ara. The kuchin, now I both say what we'll call the grave slots themselves, arkan arba amos, they are 4 amos wide, viruman sheva Tfachim, and ultimately again they have a height of 7 Tfachim, top of Kuf Aleph, Berachban Shisha, and their width is 6 Tfachim. So both say, if you pause for just a moment, everybody has that picture in Rashi? Yeah. Right? So both say, so if you look down over here, you could see, you have the Chutzner, which we didn't get to yet, but you have that Chutzner area, and I will say, the Pashtus, that Chutzner area was above ground, but you could also have a parallel Chutzner area below ground. The Ma'ara, you could see, is like the chamber of the actual burial area, and those kuchin, which are like those long rectangular protrusions, those are actually where the bodies are placed. So this is how a Talmudic burial cave, or burial complex, used to look. Back up to the top of the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon says, Ose tocha shamara sheish amos al shmona. So first thing that happens over here is that Rabbi Shimon is disagreeing with the Tanakama in terms of the dimensions of the ma'ara, the burial chamber. So whereas the Tanakama said that ultimately the burial chamber is going to be 4 amos by 6, Reb Shimon is going to say that the burial chamber is going to be 6 amos by 8. So again, we will also see what they're disagreeing about. Is there had to be some level of maneuverability in that burial chamber. We'll say, here's the second point of contention. Whereas according to the Tanakama, each ma'ara, each burial chamber has what we'll call room for 8 bodies, room for 8 graves. In Reb Shimon's model, Abosai, there's ultimately going to be room for 13 graves. 13 graves. How does he get 13 graves out of each burial chamber? This is really very interesting. Shlosha sakuch, arba'a mikan va'arba'a mikan. So we'll say 4 burial slots, we'll call them. We'll call grave chambers. 4 grave chambers on each side. Ushlosha mikanegdan, 3 opposite the entranceway to the Ma'ara. Ve'echad miyamin ha'pesach ve'echad min ha'smol. And one to the right and one to the left of the opening. So don't look too closely at the second picture, because I don't want to ruin the surprise. But you could get at least a little bit of an idea of what Reb Shimon is talking about over here. You see the Ma'ara that is 6 by 8, and again you see how he is fitting in 13 grave slots coming out of this in the Ma'ara. Now again, we'll have to make sense of this diagram in just a little bit. Va'oseh chatzer al pi ha'ma'ara, sheish al sheish. And I will say the chutzner, the courtyard, Pia Ma'ara, that is really on top, ultimately again, of the burial caves themselves, has to be an area that is 6 by 6. Sheish al sheish, kemali hamita v'kovral. We'll say, why 6 by 6? That's enough room to be able to accommodate the people carrying the aron and the mace, and the aron itself. Uposeach l'socha shtei ma'aros. And I will say, you open up into it 2 ma'aros, 2 burial caves, achas mikan va'achas mikan. So we'll say, so now we're getting to the chutzner. So let's take a step back. So just understand what's happening over here. Just stylistically, the way Mishnah is set up. The first thing the Mishnah discusses is the machlokes Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon in the ma'ara, in the actual, we'll call burial cave itself, which Rabbi say is the cave which has the offshoots of the burial slots, right, the grave chambers. So according to the Tanakama, the ma'ara has to be 4 amos by 6 amos, and you're getting a total of 6 burial slots in each cave. According to Rabbi Shimon, the ma'ara is 6 amos by 8 amos, and you're getting 13 grave slots in each burial cave. That's the first machlokes. Second machlokes, Rabbi say, is about the chutzner. You can see the chutzner is that middle area between the 2 ma'aros, between the 2 burial caves. So the Tanakama says the chutzner has to be 6 by 6. 6 amos by 6 amos. Why? Because the Tanakama says that's enough room to be able to navigate with the people holding the caskets or holding the beer or holding the body, whatever they're holding, and to be able to move around as well. So we'll say, so that's again, Chatzra Api Amar, Sheish Al Sheish, Kamal Yamita, B'Kovra, U'Posech L'Socha Shtei Ma'aros, Achas Mikan V'Achas Mikan. Furthermore, I will say in the Tanakama's model, every Chatzar is attached to 2 Ma'aros, as you can see on the first picture. So every Chatzar itself, there are 2 Ma'aros per Chatzar. Rabbi Shimon says no. He says arba la'arba'a ruchoseha. We'll say ultimately Rabbi Shimon says that in fact each chutzner comes with 4 ma'aros. And I will say you can see that ultimately again in Rabbi Shimon's picture, in the second picture over here. You see that Rabbi Shimon has 4 ma'aros extending off of the chutzner. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, so just before we go on, understand what the Mishnah is talking about over here. What the Mishnah is talking about over here is, Ruvain hires me to construct for him a kever. What the Mishnah, the machlokes of Shimon and Tanakama will say is what? What is the basic definition of a kever? That is their fundamental machlokes over here. What is the basic definition of a kever? Was there, and the Mishnah ends off with a very interesting statement. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Hakol lefi hasela. I will say, when digging a burial complex, how big and how intricate it is, all depends on the earth. All depends on the earth. Now, what does this mean? Take a look at the Rashbam. The Rashbam says, Hakol lefi hasela. What is this referring to? Akuchin koi. I will say it refers ultimately again to the burial slot. We'll call them the grave slots themselves. Shemakarka chazak ein tzarech hefresh ama ben koch lekosel va'ose yosra miyur gimel kuchin v'msela ba biyadayim yarchik yosra me'ama zemizeh v'lo ya'ase yosra midales. So we'll say, it's an amazing thing. So if you attend Levias, so you know, it's always fascinating to see just the different earth consistency in different graveyards, right? In different cemeteries, right? So there are whatever. I don't have to get into specific examples, but there are certain cemeteries where again the earth is much more like sand, which of course for Levi is often very helpful. And then there are other cemeteries where the consistency of the earth is like clay. Is mamish like clay. So what Rav Shimon Gamliel says is, okay, you guys could duke all this out in terms of how many grave slots, how far the grave slots, but you understand that a lot of this has to do with the consistency of the earth. If the consistency of the earth is what the Rashbam calls Salah Haba Biadayim. Salah Biadayim ultimately means that it's sandy. The earth is very fine. Then you have to distance the kuchin. You have to distance ultimately the grave slots much further. Otherwise, if they're too close together, what ends up happening is the walls crumble. And it also could be, by the way, that the earth above could cave in. Ultimately again to the grave itself. So Shimon Gamliel says, this is all fine in a vacuum, meaning we can have this discussion, but Lamais at the end of the day, tachlitically, when you have to decide ultimately how it is, what to build, who to build, so Lamais again, that's going to depend on the actual quality of the earth. I neglected to mention before that our shir this morning is dedicated by Leon and Julia Sheinman in commemoration of the yahrzeit, the 16th yahrzeit of Leon's father, Moshe ben Simcha. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah's neshama will have an aliyah. Thank you. So I'll say, so let's continue. Says the Gemara, Hani Trey Lehecha Shadila. So we'll say, now what the Gemara is picking up on is the following. So here's what's interesting. This is really quite fascinating. So, I mean, I guess in a dark way, but it is still fascinating. So the Gemara says the following: Hani Trei Lehecha Shari. So we'll say, here's what we know. In Rav Shimon's model, remember Rav Shimon's model is the second picture. I told you not to look too closely at it because this picture kind of gives away a little bit as to what the conclusion is going to be. What the Gemara is asking is the following. Reb Shimon told me that every ma'ara has 13 slots, has 13 burial slots. So I will say, so I understand where you get 11 of those, right? Because you can have 4 on each side, 4 on each side, and 3 opposite the entranceway into the corner. Rav Shimon in the Mishnah said, his lashon was, Echad miyamin ha-Pesach ve'echad min ha-smol. And there's 2 more, one to the right of the doorway, one to the left of the doorway. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? So he says, Hani trei lehecha shadilu. Ilibrai. So I'll say, if you want to say, so Shaila is, ultimately, where are those 2 extra burial slots, burial tunnels going? If you want to see Abba say librai, now librai means literally outside. What that means over here is if they're going underneath the chutzner. If that's the idea over here, that somehow they're being dug underneath the chutzner, Abba say here's the problem. Ha kamistadshi lahu. Abba say here's the problem. If those 2 extra burial slots, those 2 extra burial tubes, are being dug underneath the chutzner itself, meaning that they're extending underneath the chutzner, we've got a big problem. Why? V'hatnan chatzar hakever ha'omed b'socho tahor. So Rabosai, again, remember, if you stand on top of a grave, we'll get into some of the details, but Lamaisa, again, Tuma is Ola Obakas. Tuma goes up. So Lamaisa, again, if you're telling me now that Rabbi Shimon is putting, those 2 extra, we'll call it burial slots, extending it underneath the ma'ara, the chatzar. So for example, even if you take a look at the first picture, so for Rabbi Shimon, even though this is the Tanakama's picture, it's not Rabbi Shimon's picture, but if you could imagine, by the entrance of the ma'ara, if Rabbi Shimon is extending those 2 extra graves underneath the chatzar, we've got a problem, I will say, because again, that would mean that those who stand in the chatzar automatically become tamei. Yet we learned that those who stand in the chatzar are tahor. Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, I will say this is amazing. Da'avid luhu kamin nagar. Ultimately, again, how do they make those graves? We'll say like a nagar. A nagar, we'll say, is literally like a door bolt. What does that mean? Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. He says it's the first Rashbam. The last Rashbam on the page. David like kamin nagar. Last 2 lines. Min ol shel Pesach. This is like the bolt or the lock of the door. V'zakuf sheyored milamala lemata. Kein asa shnei kuchin mishnei tzidei ha-Pesach zukufin kamin bar amukin dalet amos rakman. So listen to this. It could be Rav Shimon's model that the 2 extra graves Rabbi say are not dug are not dug across, but are dug down. So what does that mean? I was saying that it could be that the two graves were actually dug where people were buried standing up. Those are the two additional graves that were built. So they were dug into the ground, not across, and therefore the mice, again, that's how he gets the extra two. So as I said, the Gemara says that can't be. V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan says, Amud Beis, kavuras chamorim hizu. That's how you bury donkeys. I was also say, what does that mean? So take a look at the Rashbam. How do you bury donkeys? So the Rashbam says, Shamashlichin babar. The answer is you don't bury donkeys, you throw them into a pit. But the idea is that notion of burying someone standing up is seen as a degradation, right? It's seen as something degrading ultimately to the mace. I must say now, I just have to share with you something amazing that I saw over here. So I saw brought down, this is from the Sefer Daf al Daf. He writes over here, he quotes from the Rebbe of Lubavitch, who says something amazing. He says, Lemuva ki Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes bikesh sheik baruhu ba'amida. So the Rebbe writes that Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes, right? Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes requested that he be buried standing up. Why? V'yitnu makel biyado, and that he requested to be buried standing up with a staff in his hand. And you should know, today in many Chevra Kadishas, the custom is that we do put a stick in the hands of a mace. Interestingly enough, you'll see what that's based on. So Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes requested that he be buried standing up, and ultimately with a staff in his hand. Listen to how beautiful this is. In order that he should be ready to go out and to greet Mashiach. Sheyavo b'Tiveria. Somehow again they had a Mesorah that the Mashiach would first begin in Tiveria. Lelo shehios zman klal. Without losing any time. Afidu lo hazman shel kima. Mimatzav shel shchiva lamatzav shel avida. Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes did not want to lose any time in being makabel b'pnei Melech HaMashiach, not even the amount of time that it takes to get up from a laying down position to a standing up position. Therefore, he requested to be buried standing up. It was an incredible story. So then actually goes on. There's apparently like an incredible discussion about whether or not this wish was actually honored. Whether or not, again, did they bury Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes standing up or not? One thing is clear, which is at the end of the day, we would not do this. We would not do this stand because it's seen ultimately as a degradation to the mace. But the shaila ultimately is, if the mace was specifically requested, would we do it? So that seems to be a major machlokes. But again, I will say, just what's amazing about that is to be able to have such a yearning for Mashiach. To be able to have such a yearning for Mashiach not only in your life, but to be able to have such a yearning for Mashiach in your death is something absolutely amazing and inspiring. In any event, so the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon, I don't understand, where are you putting those two graves? So we'll say, if they're extending out underneath the chutzner, that's problematic, because then ultimately someone standing in the chutzner would become tameh. If you're telling me that they're being dug into the ground, down into the ground, and bless you, and that a person is being buried standing up, that can't be, because that's kvuras chamorim. To which the Gemara says, so what's kvuras chamorim izu? Rabbi Yochanan da'avid lehu. So the Gemara says, da'avid lehu bekeren zavis. So we'll say, what's the case over here? The case over here, ultimately, again, is where you dig those additional graves, Rabbi say, in the corner. In the corner. So we'll say, so what does that mean? So the way you would dig it, ultimately, again, it appears, is that if you take a look, by the way, on Amud Beis, at picture Aleph. At picture Aleph, so Rabbi say again, you're going ahead and you're digging it at the corners over here. So meaning the two extra graves are dug opposite the entry into the Ma'ara, and they protrude from the corners. So here's the problem. Vaha nagi kuchin lahadadi. The only problem with that, Rabbi say, is what? Is that the burial slots are going to end up bumping into each other. In other words, we'll say, it looks fine on the picture, but Lamaisa, practically with the space, they're going to end up eating the space of one another. Amar Rav Ashi ben Ma'amek. So also Rav Ashi says over here, now what's the case about saying? The two extra ones that ultimately, again, are put in at the corners are dug deeper than the rest. So we'll say, whereas all the other burial tubes, we'll call them, are dug on the same level, those two, according to Rabbi Shimon, those two at the corner are dug deeper than the rest of, we'll say, so that they don't end up overlapping with anything else. So the Gemara says, "Dilo temahachi," because I will say, if you don't understand it, you'll see why I have to say that in just a moment. If you don't say it this way, then "Dilo temahachi arba amos Rabbi Shimon heichi avid lahu ha." Kanogi kuchin lahadadi. So we'll say, if you remember, go back to Amud Aleph just for one moment. So if you look back at Amud Aleph for just a moment, do you see the picture there? Remember, the first picture there is the Tanakama. The second picture there is Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, what's the problem with Rabbi Shimon's model? The problem is you have crisscrossing of kuchin. And we'll say, you can't have crisscrossing. How does that work? So it only works in one way, which is ma'amik. So I'll say, if you could imagine for just a moment, in this picture over here, when it looks like some of the kuchin are on top, right, on some of the other kuchin, so ultimately, again, it's a simple idea. You're burying, meaning you're digging down, you're digging below. So I will say, so this can mean a number of things. This can mean either, again, that they dug out, meaning it could be that the ma'ara itself was not all on one level. The ma'ara itself had different levels with different kuchin. Or also the possibility is what? That the kuchin, some of them, at least the ones that were potentially had intersected, were dug at an angle. So we'll say one thing is clear. See, this also, by the way, is a fascinating machlokes. In halacha, Shulchan Aruch paskins that the way we bury a person is ultimately, again, on their back, with their eyes closed, and their hands on top of them, like this. Their hands on top of them. The Shlosha Shulchan Aruch is that we bury them as if they are sleeping. So it appears, according to most of the poskim, that Lamaisa, again, the only problem is burying someone standing up. Burying someone at an angle may not be as problematic. How sharp the angle could be might be a different discussion. So whether Rabbi Shimon is saying that you're burying at an angle, or Rabbi Shimon is literally saying that ma'amik means you would exit. In other words, if you can imagine, in Rabbi Shimon's model, you just might have a ma'ara of two different levels. You'd have a step. Right, so again, there's two graves that are dug at the lower level, and a number of graves dug at the higher level. But Lamaisa, that's the only way. That's the only way. Not only that the extra two graves work, but the truth is in Rabbi Shimon's model, that's the only way this whole thing works. Because otherwise, you have intersecting graves, which I will say, of course, does not work. How can I Ella? Back to Kuf Aleph on the base. We'll say fifth line in Ella b'ma'amik hachanayim b'ma'amik. Fine. So Rav Yoshua Amar. So we'll say Rav Yoshua said, Arba ma'aros Rabbi Shimon da'avid lahu ki charusa. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so comes along Rav Yoshua, and he says that the four caves, the four burial caves of Rabbi Shimon Rabbi say have to be made ki charusa. We'll say ki charusa means like a palm branch. Like a palm branch. Now, both say, if you take a look, this is actually on Kuf Aleph Amud Beis at picture Gimel. Picture Gimel over there. If you see it, Ki Charusa will say, it looks like a palm branch. Why does it look like a palm branch? Because they'll say, if you ever see a palm tree, so you notice again, the leaves don't extend out straight. The leaves are curved. So Rav Yoshua suggests that in Rabbi Shimon's model, in order to accommodate all of the graves themselves are arranged like this palm branch. But the Gemara comments on this. It says, oh, by the way, this statement of Rav Yoshua is Barusa. I will say, Barusa literally means on the outside. That is a nice way of saying he's wrong. Right? Rav Yoshua is wrong. Now, why is he wrong? I will say, simply the Gemara says, because the math does not work. After all, the Gemara says, Amen. The Gemara says over here, Kol Amsa Beribua. So the Gemara says, remember, every Amma. So the Gemara says, every Amma. I'm sorry, where are we over here? Michti. Kol Amsa Beribua. Amsa Utrei Chumshi Ba'alachsuna. So we'll say every Amma of one side of a square equals 1 1/5 of the diagonal of that square. So the Gemara says, Kama haviluhu. So we'll say, how much space does that give you, therefore, for grave digging? To which the Gemara says, Kama haviluhu, Chad Sari v'chumsha. We'll say, that gives you 11 1/5 amos. Kuchen, Kama havu. We'll say, how much space does each grave, Kuchen, remember, is the burial slot. How much does each one take up? So we'll say, Kuchen, Kama havu. Timnia, ultimately 8. Timnia, Bechad Sari v'chumsha, Hechi Mishkachasla. We'll say, how are you going to fit 8 graves, ultimately, again, in the space of 11 and 1/5 amos? Therefore, I will say the suggestion of Rabbi Yoshua that Rabbi Shimon's model works when essentially the grave slots, the kuchin, are angled is an outside or mistaken opinion. So again, remember, we're just trying to figure out ultimately again, how does Rabbi Shimon get 13 burial slots, 13 kuchin coming off this ma'ara without automatically overlapping with other kuchin from other ones? So again, I want to be clear. Rabbi Shimon's model is only problematic. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon goes with the approach that every chatzar has 4 associated ma'aros. If you would just have, like the Tanakama, 2 ma'aros, then we're golden, we're fine, we understand how you can get everything. But Lamaisa, again, with 4 ma'aros, we've got a problem. To which the Gemara is, so answer number 1 is ma'amik. Answer number 1 is not all of the kuchin, not all of the grave slots were dug on the same level, some were dug deeper to avoid overlapping. We'll say the Gemara gives another answer. I will say, what type of graves? What type of graves ultimately again was Rabbi Shimon referring to? He was referring ultimately again to graves for a nafel, to graves for either for chas v'shalom stillborns or for miscarriages. Also, the halacha is both the stillborn as well as a miscarriage. There is a din of kvura. There's a din of kvura. Again, different halachos apply to at what point in time the pregnancy was lost. But Lamaisa, assuming that there's some level of tzuras havlad, so there's some level of shape, human shape, there's an obligation of kurin. I will say, obviously, the halacha is that if you have certain graves designated for nephilim, for children who did not survive, stillborns and miscarriages, those graves are obviously what? Much smaller. So I will say, so it's possible that ultimately, again, the way that Rabbi Shimon avoids any level of overlapping is what? Is that the potentially overlapping graves would be for nafels, would ultimately be for miscarriages. And therefore, again, because of that, those graves are much smaller, and because of that, you avoid any type of overlapping. Look at the Rashbam for just a moment. And I'll say it's the first of the widest lines in the Rashbam. So it's like this is an alternative answer to ma'amik, right? This is an alternative answer ultimately again to digging the overlapping grave slots deeper down. Ella osan shnei kuchin. So we'll say ultimately again, just very simply, because those graves are smaller, therefore by definition, they will not overlap with anything else. Okay, so we'll say this Gemara goes weiter. Tanan Hasam. We'll say we'll begin this today, we'll continue this into tomorrow, but the Gemara begins with an interesting case. Hamotze, last 2 lines, kafala from the base. Hamotze meis mushkav kidarko. We'll say I find the corpse, I find the body, that is mushkav kidarko. Now we'll say, let's take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Hamotze meis, tchila shalo noda ad achshav shahaya kan meis. We'll talk about a situation where I come upon a corpse, and I had a buried corpse. I had no idea that someone was buried here. Okay, so skip down to next Rashbam. So I'm sorry, before I read the Rashbam, Samotse meis mushav kidarko. If I go and I find the corpse, find the regular corpse, what's the halacha? Note low. So I will say I am permitted to move the corpse. Meaning, what does it mean I'm permitted to move the corpse? I'm permitted to go ahead and move the body to a cemetery. And not have the body here in the middle of nowhere. We'll say it's not as much alts kavod ames as much as it is out of a concern that people aren't going to realize that there's a body buried here. So I could go ahead and move the body. I will say the halacha is whenever you move a body, so note lo ve'es tefusaso. I will say you move the body. But whenever you move the body, whenever you rebury a body, you have to take the surrounding earth around the body as well. We'll discuss how much earth. The assumption over there is that there's some level of decomposition. So because of that, again, the mace is not just its body, but the mace also began to decompose into the surrounding earth. As such, again, the surrounding earth also has the din of the mace, and therefore it has to be taken as well. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Mace mushkav kidarko notlo ve'es tefusaso. Im rotza lasos sham taharos. So say if I want to be able to use that area for taharos, for things that are ritually pure, Mefaneo lemes. Mishum delo kana makomo. So we'll say, I could do this because we assume, we'll have to discuss the circumstances, but normally, well, let me say it differently. This mace was not kona its makom. This mace did not acquire this sfat as versa. And we'll discuss why that is. Kozman to lahavu shlosha. The ikal lemar lahaya makom azem makom kavura. Ela ayidei adchak. Shelo haya lahem pinai lo licho lebeis hakvarus. Kavruhu sham. So we'll say, we assume that, so how does a person get there, right? How is a person buried in the middle of nowhere? So it's quite possible, that's what? Somebody passed away, they didn't have the ability to take him to a regular cemetery, so they just buried him here. Kavruhu sham. Umiu, kevan demesu v'lo harug, umushkav kidarko, not algamas tefusaso kid mefarshon seches nazir, kamashir tefusa, Berish, Nota offer tichuach, v'chofer shlosha tfachim bekarka psula, v'nota hakol, techashivi karekav hames. So we'll say, so this is actually just an interesting piece of information. So the halacha is, you have to take all of the surrounding soft earth around the mace, plus 3 additional tfachim of earth. 3 additional tfachim of earth. So we'll say, it's an amazing thing, meaning just, you see this when you have to relocate a grave, especially after a while, was when the body begins to decompose. It's amazing how far the body fragments or the body pieces, I don't mean like flesh, I mean like bone fragments, spread. I guess it's because of settling of soil or all different kinds of things. But the halacha is you have to take the surrounding afer tichuach, which is any bit of loose soil around the body, plus 3 additional tfachim of soil. Now, I'm sorry? No. So if it's the casket, that's a different idea. This is assuming A, there's no casket, right? And B, this could also be after some substantial amount of time. If there's a casket, then the casket is fully intact. Because sometimes, again, the casket's not intact. But I might say if it's fully intact, that's a different discussion. I will say, now understand something. Where do we learn this out from? And this is amazing. Where do we learn out this din? That a body ultimately, when you move a mace, you have to take the surrounding earth as well. This is amazing. V'naf galon midechsev unisasani mimitzrayim. I will say, interestingly enough, where do we learn this from? We learn this from the pasuk unisasani mimitzrayim. That ultimately, again, mimitzrayim tol imi. Right? So Yaakov and Yosef says the same thing. Right? They say, take me from Egypt. What does he take me from Egypt? Mimitzrayim tolimi. Make sure to take me from Egypt with some of Egypt. In other words, that when you move my body, then ultimately go ahead and take some of Mitzrayim with me. Kilomar, mikarka Mitzrayim. So we'll say, so the Rashbam then goes on to explain, which we're not going to get into right now, which is, I will say, what happens, the distinctions between someone who is buried after what we'll call a natural death versus someone who's a harug. Someone ultimately, well, look at the next line, just read this. So he says, Aval im havi harug shamatsu maguyad. We'll say somebody was murdered, and you find them buried in this place. Lo kana makomo klal. We'll say they don't acquire their space at all. Afilu l'tfusa v'ikal meimar sham nerag v'nafas. Okay, we're not going to get into this now, but the Rashbam gets into the halacha. So we'll say, under what circumstances does a mace acquire its space? It's not mace, not acquire its space. We'll say back up to the Gemara just for one moment, and then we're going to stop. So we'll say, so what happens? So I go ahead, I find the corpse. So what's the halacha? I am permitted to relocate that corpse, assuming that I take the surrounding earth with me. Now we'll say, here's where it gets interesting. Shnayim, let's say I find 2 corpses, right? Then I will say, same halacha, I can relocate those corpses by going ahead, moving them, and taking the surrounding earth. However, so note on that's 2 sasa. I will say, tap off kuf beis on aleph. Listen to this, here it gets much more intriguing. Matzah shlosha. Right? So I will say, I now found 3 corpses. So I will say, this is quite a day. Right? I now found 3 corpses. So I will say, see now, what's the shaila? The shaila that I have to begin to ask myself is what? Right? So first of all, how am I spending my time? That's number 1, right? That's the first shaila. I will say, now the bigger shaila is, have I just stumbled upon a cemetery? Right, that's my real shayla. I mean, okay, you find 1 corpse, fine. You find 2 corpses, fine. Now you found 3 corpses. Have I just stumbled upon a cemetery? So we'll say, so we're going to see ultimately again, im yesh beinehen me arba at shmona hare zu shchunas kvaros. So we'll say, if there is between at least 4 amos and a maximum of 8 amos between body 1 and body 3, then it's quite possible that I've stumbled upon a cemetery. So stop over here for today. We'll discuss halacha l'maisa again, what that practically means, and again how I conduct myself going forward. Shkoyach.
Saeed has asked everyone take their baggage back to the main terminal. In other words, take your Gemaras from the room. Thank you.
David, whatever happened with that? Just shut this off.